In part one, we established that deceleration is not just a mirror image of acceleration. It has unique mechanical demands that lead to differences in the fatigue that deceleration causes. So the logical next step is to question how we can test deceleration capacity in applied field-based settings. Monitoring deceleration load helps us understand our athletes' exposure to this demand over time. But testing is more focused on assessing their capacity of this movement demand. I'm going to cover monitoring deceleration load in a separate video, and in this video we're going to focus solely on our capacity to actually test someone's ability to decelerate. An individual's deceleration capacity then reflects how well an athlete can reduce their momentum under high braking demands. And yet deceleration capacity isn't just a single quality. So in part one, we talked about Damien Harper and his colleagues creating the braking performance framework. And we can see then that the horizontal deceleration ability is underpinned by both strength capacities in terms of their neuromuscular qualities, but also biomechanical aspects with their technical ability to decelerate. And this is almost moderated as well through the inter and intra-limb coordination between these two areas. Ultimately, to test deceleration, we want to ascertain the time taken to reduce velocity between two different points. So, of course, deceleration is somewhat different to testing maximal acceleration or maximal speed, where everyone is starting at zero. Given the nature of deceleration, then, we need the athletes to build up some level of speed from which they then have to decelerate themselves. And this does complicate things because deceleration scores are dependent on the velocity reached before braking. So in terms of test protocols, we need to think about how we are trying to control the period before the individual is demanded to decelerate and how we try to constrain that to get the same intensity, essentially, of deceleration from our athletes. We'll see in a moment with a few different testing options how we try to do that, but ultimately there is still this relationship between their velocity reached and their deceleration, and so that certainly complicates making comparisons between athletes. We also have the fact that momentum is key, so momentum being the product of mass and velocity, and therefore our athletes with higher body mass have to work harder to decelerate themselves from the same velocity. This again reiterates that challenge of comparing different athletes that either reach different speeds or have different body mass. So again, I really do think currently the focus of any data that we're collecting in terms of deceleration testing is to be used for within athlete comparison. In the research, we've also seen differences in terms of using a pre-planned deceleration approach versus a reactive deceleration testing approach. And much like comparing change of direction, which can be pre-planned, to agility, which has to involve a reactive component, these then are incorporating different aspects of performance, and particularly that cognitive aspect when you introduce reactivity. So neither is right or wrong, but you need to make an intentional decision around which you are choosing to test. And then also when you're looking in the research at other findings in terms of deceleration, to always be on the lookout for the specific protocol they use and whether it was that pre-planned aspect or the reactive approach. Here then we have three types of approaches for assessing deceleration. Firstly, we might incorporate some form of sharp change of direction. Most commonly, this might be tested using a 505 test. So by incorporating this change of direction, this 180-degree turn, we are forcing the athlete to have to maximally decelerate and to have to reduce their velocity to zero. Secondly, then we have our stop at a preset distance where the athletes are increasing their speed up to a sprint before then having to decelerate themselves and stop at a particular point that is based on this, whatever this distance might be. So in that example, whilst we're constraining where the athlete needs to stop, we might also constrain where they should start their deceleration. And you can see that in this third example where there is a marker here where they start their deceleration before backpedaling through. Again, the backpedal, just like the 180-degree turn, is this constraint to make the athlete have to reduce their velocity to zero. We can see with each of these different approaches, we have the ability to use timing gates. So in Wald's case, we can use the SmartSpeed product, maybe even at a couple of places during the test to be able to measure the athlete's time as they're progressing through accelerating and decelerating in these tasks. So if you've done any research into deceleration or perhaps watched part 1, you'll be familiar with Damien Harper's research that has really led the way for a lot of the recent work in deceleration. And he has created this ADA test, the acceleration-deceleration test. You can see the protocol here where we've got a 20-meter distance from a standing start to increase our speed. In that 20 meters of space, athletes should have the capacity or the opportunity to reach near, if not maximum, speeds. That therefore gives us our maximal horizontal sprint test. But at that 20-meter line, then athletes are instructed to maximally decelerate as quickly as they can. So that distance will vary between different athletes to then backpedal to that 20-meter line that marked the end of the 20-meter sprint and the start of the deceleration. Again, we are just using that backpedal as a way to force our athletes to have to stop their momentum, bring their velocity to zero, and then that consistent way of backpedaling back to that 20-meter line. So I previously talked in my speed testing video about some of the important considerations when using timing gates such as Wald's SmartSpeed. And in this test then we'd want to make sure that we were starting from a consistent stance, whether that's upright, split stance, and also from a consistent position in terms of where the athlete start relating to that start line and that timing gate. So in one of Damien's publications, then he actually had them starting 30 centimeters before the start line in a split stance. So with this test, we want to ideally have the timing gates set up so that we can split up the acceleration and deceleration portion and hone in on those different times. We can even use the data from our prior sprint tests to try to constrain that initial velocity from which our athletes decelerate. So if we see that they are perhaps 5% slower than what they are at best in their 20-meter sprint time, we may want to remove that trial because it will not necessarily reflect their maximum deceleration capacities. As well as our speed timing gate outcome measures, then we might combine this test with a radar gun if we have access to it to get more measures of the acceleration and deceleration throughout the course of the test. And we might also combine it with 2D camera analysis if we are filming particularly that deceleration portion of the test, given the technical demands of deceleration. Probably the other most commonly used test for deceleration, although traditionally we think of it maybe purely as a change of direction task, is the 505 test. In the 505 test, then we have a start line followed by a 10-meter period to be able to build up speed before then our timing gates at that point between the 10-meter build-up and then the final 5 meters, at which point the athletes then turn on a particular line and then accelerate again back through 5 meters. We have to decide what protocol we want to use for our starting point. Do we want our athletes behind the line at a controlled distance, whether that's 30 centimeters or 50 centimeters, before they actually break through that barrier? And also we need to be consistent with specifically what stance they start in, because that can also affect the outcomes of a sprint or acceleration test. So given the more linear nature of the AIDA test, this really standardizes the braking task involved in the test. With the 505 test, then we're introducing this change of direction component, which does introduce more variability into the test, because the individual's capacity and technique for actually changing direction itself will be a component, and one that we may not therefore be able to clearly distinguish. However, we try to overcome this by calculating the deceleration deficit. This was put forward by Rich Clark, and it is calculated by taking the 15-meter approach from the 505 test and subtracting then the athlete's linear 15-meter sprint time. Really, then, this is helping to identify the athletes whose change of direction speed performance may be limited by their deceleration ability. So the 505 test then, and in particular calculating the deceleration deficit, can help add some more contextual information about how much braking demand or ability our athletes demonstrate when a turn is introduced. But of course, here we're also still dealing in that linear plane, even with the change of direction. And actually, perhaps curvy linear demands occur a lot more frequently in many team sports. And whilst I won't go into that in detail in this video, you can have a look at this article on the VAL Performance website, written by Lucas Galmiche and Dr. Morgan Williams, talking about the importance of testing curvy linear sprints and decelerations using SmartSpeed timing gates. Finally, one other thing I want to raise in this discussion around testing deceleration capacity is potentially the ability to get proxy performance measures from some of our other test types that we've spoken about. With deceleration capacities, we see associations with an athlete's drop jump capacity. Now, this makes complete sense because, of course, in a drop jump, the athletes are having to demonstrate their reactive strength, their ability to attenuate the force that they create from the initial drop, and then absorb that force and then create a jump out of it as well. And essentially with a deceleration, that's a similar demand in terms of this absorption of force and then a change of direction. And this relationship was explored in more detail in this study, again led by Damien Harper, in which he looked at the association across 29 different university athletes in both their drop jump ability along with their horizontal deceleration ability. Athletes with greater drop jump reactive strength index, so RSI, as I've spoken about in a previous video, they demonstrated superior horizontal deceleration ability. And unsurprisingly, there were also associations between their deceleration ability and the underlying components of RSI, so their ground contact time and their jump height. If you don't have the capacity for on-field deceleration testing, then maybe your drop jumps can also provide a proxy measure of their ability. If you have access to both, then certainly it'd be of interest to actually explore these relationships in your data set and your specific population to see if these associations are also upheld. Hopefully then this video has illustrated actually the complications that we face when trying to assess deceleration ability. We have a couple of options through the AIDA test, through the 505 test, but we have to remember the strengths of that data as well as the limitations of those tests. The fact that deceleration capacity is so strongly linked to the velocity that athletes reach prior to their deceleration. So how do we control for that velocity being reached? And then the complexity that that introduces to making any between athlete comparisons, given potential differences in momentum through both velocity differences as well as body mass differences. But certainly these are pretty accessible field tests that we can introduce into our setting, adding objectivity through our SmartSpeed timing gates, and as always with any of these tests, the real insight will come when we combine the data collected with information from all other tests to get a nice 360-degree profile of our athletes and their physical capacities. So that's our testing of deceleration capacity. In my next video then, I'm going to be talking about how we count decelerations and the challenges as well with trying to monitor the deceleration load that our athletes are exposed to. But for now, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon for another Sports Science Insights video.